This morning's Gospel reading is taken from Luke 9, verses 51 to 62. Samaritan opposition. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. The cost of following Jesus. As they were walking along the road, a man said to him, "I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." He said to another man, "Follow me." But the man replied, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Still another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family." Jesus replied, "No one who puts his hand to the plough and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." This is the gospel of Christ.
Praise to Christ. Loving God, your word is a lamp to our path and a guide to our feet. Be with us now as we reflect on your word. Amen. The idea, the idea that there is a price to pay to follow Christ comes as a big surprise to many in today's world. Jesus, you see, is so often presented as the ultimate solution to every problem. So much so that sharing the good news is relegated to the idea that following Christ is the real deal that people need to buy into. However, the Bible presents a very different Christ to the popular image that some Christians hold on to. Perhaps our problem is that we see Christianity as a man-centered religion. Some think that the reason Christ came was to make life more pleasurable for us. But such thinking actually betrays a sentimental view of Christianity and is naive, I think, and foreign to the Scriptures. As we reflect on that reading from Luke that George has shared with us, I think the challenge we face as Christian people is to be aware of the cost of discipleship, because there is a cost. Each one of the three would-be followers of Jesus wanted to address their own concerns first of all. In verses 57 to 62, Jesus challenges his hearers to chart a course leading to the kingdom of God. And we need to focus our attention on the kingdom of God and steer away from those things that would divert us from the course that we're called to follow. In fact, today's reading is quite uncompromising and perhaps at first glance even seems rather harsh. But again and again, Jesus emphasised the kingdom of God in his teaching and in his preaching. In fact, there's more than 100 references to the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven in the first 3 Gospels. The kingdom of God really means the rule of God or the reign of God. And Jesus taught his disciples that the kingdom of God is both present and future. The kingdom is present because Jesus has come and has established it. Yet the kingdom of God is still future because Christ hasn't returned yet to establish it. He hasn't returned yet, we might say, to establish his rule over the new heaven and the new earth. As we read the Gospels, various pictures of Jesus come to us. In our mind's eye, perhaps we can see Jesus setting out resolutely for Jerusalem, leading his disciples as they accompanied him toward the cross. Jesus had come to the end of his work of teaching and healing, and he'd gathered around him a little band of disciples that he would leave behind to carry on. It was God's will for him, which he accepted and acted on. But it wasn't the beginning of the end. I think rather it was the end of the beginning. For the living of our lives here, you and I have a one-way ticket, as we well know. As we get more grey hair and wrinkled skin, have we? Yes? More grey hair and wrinkled skin. White hair, is it? Hopefully we will realise that the day is in fact fast spent. But there is still much to do, and it can only be done while it is still daylight. Night draws on when no one can see to work. And it's to that cross that we follow Jesus. We can only follow some distance off, of course, as we strain to see into that darkness, which on Easter morning became a mystery of light. The old story tells us again that Jesus knew what it was in store for him in Jerusalem. But he also knew he would rise from the grave, that a better day would really be dawn. Both his suffering and his triumph were the way set before him. But Jesus put the welfare of the kingdom over his own feelings and comfort. As always, Christians today, I think, need to follow Jesus' example. And yes, I think at times it is a hard road. We have a definite role to play in God's kingdom, and he gives each one of us spiritual gifts to build up his body, the church. As St. Paul tells us, the rule of God frees us to love neighbour as you love yourself. The challenge to each of us is to unselfishly place a higher priority on kingdom matters than on personal concerns and comforts. We're called to be obedient in all things, and like Jesus, not allow the cares of this world to distract us from the course that God has charted for you and for me to follow. And we know how hard a lesson it is for us to learn. As Jesus and his disciples travelled toward Jerusalem, they met 3 men who wanted to become followers of Jesus. As we heard read, the first man said, "I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." A strange reply, you might think. But Jesus wanted the man to count the cost of following him. Having no home, Jesus was always on the move, teaching, preaching, and healing. Why didn't Jesus invite the man to come along with his little band? Well, it seems the man's enthusiasm was only skin deep. Jesus was asking that man if he was willing to give up the comforts of home. And apparently the answer was no, because the cost was too high. And then we read of Jesus inviting the second man to come. And he replies, "First, let me go and bury my father." Well, we might think the man wanted to be at his father's funeral. But no, what he was really saying was, "Let me wait until my father dies, and then I'll follow you." And so we can see that family obligations to do with inheritance issues were at the top of that man's priorities. Doesn't Jesus' response seem strange, even harsh? He said, "Leave the dead to bury their own dead. But you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." So what did Jesus mean by saying that? Well, I think what he was saying was that the man should join his disciples on their journey, leaving the spiritually dead to bury the physically dead. Jesus saw that man's potential, but the man had family distractions. And don't we all have family issues which are really ministry imperatives? Well, of course we do, because charity does begin at home, yes. There seems to be a paradox here. However, in this saying of Jesus, he wasn't telling his disciples to neglect their parents' care. Jesus' concern for his own mother as he hung on that cross shows that wasn't the case at all. But Jesus wanted the man to commit himself to God's rule and to trust God to provide for his family's welfare. You see, Luke's telling about Jesus meeting these people tells us that the gospel is time sensitive. We people need to be open to it within the time frames set by God, because the time is short. The messengers and the missionary church are called to put aside some traditions and customs whenever there's not time for them. The gospel of Christ is to be served first, or it won't be served at all. Lastly, another man said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me say goodbye to those at home." But the man was really saying, "Let me go home to put all my affairs in order and then at a later time, I will follow you. Jesus' reply was a stern warning to that man and to all who would follow him. He said, "No one who puts his hand to the plough and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." Farmers don't look back to plough a straight line. They're looking ahead. Jesus took a familiar proverb and I think gave it a very new meaning. And of course a farmer must look ahead, or he can't plough a straight furrow. So Jesus applies this agricultural imagery to the kingdom of God. If we continually look back, and yes we do, don't we, to things left behind, we will be ineffective in the ministry tasks to which we've been called. So we can conclude, I think, that Christ's call for us to follow him is radical indeed, and in our humanity we do struggle with the demands of being his hands and feet in this life. And yes, it is human to want the security of a home where the door can be shut against the demands of others. But God deals with our infirmities, and his willingness to do that allows for both our inability and sometimes our unwillingness to take him at his word. As we look back and make our crooked furrows, God still uses us as he sows his seed in our weaving ways, and he stays with us as he has promised to do. That's wonderful, isn't it? That's very, very reassuring that in our humanity, where we don't get things right, we do weaving ways. Finally, may each one of us remember that even the most ordinary, repetitive life lived in our places of home and work can be a journey to Jerusalem. Our lives can testify to the love of God striving for a better world with a deep concern for other people. There will surely be times of discouragement and seeming futility, yes. But a vision of Jesus' lonely figure, pressing on to fulfill God's purposes, can give us courage and hope. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem to die. His only security is in God, and his only hope is in God's future. The good news of Christ assures those who would take him at his word. You, who look forward and not too often back, that your only lasting home will be in God's future as well. Loving God, when your call to follow clearly comes, may we not hesitate, O Lord, but wholeheartedly let all securities go and risk being your lifelong disciple. Amen.